A trembling black man stands at a Texas gas station, surrounded by flashing lights and shouting orders. A furious officer grips his handcuffs. The crowd watches in silence until one calm voice cuts through the chaos. Keanu Reeves steps forward and asks, "Do you need a witness?" What happens next will shake the entire nation. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The Texas sun blazed mercilessly over the cracked concrete of a dusty roadside gas station off Highway 84. The heat shimmered above the fuel pumps like invisible fire. A middle-aged man named David Carter leaned against his dented blue Chevy pickup, wiping sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. His shirt was soaked through, his face lined with fatigue. He had been driving since dawn, an endless trip back from visiting his wife in the hospital after her gallbladder surgery. He just wanted to get home. As the fuel clicked and stopped, David sighed with relief. He reached for the nozzle, lost in his thoughts, when a sharp burst of sirens shattered the still air. His heart jumped. A black and white patrol car screeched into the station, gravel spraying under its tires. From inside, the cruiser stepped Officer Hank Dobson, a tall, broad man in his 50s. His face was red from the heat or anger, maybe both. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but his voice came out sharp and commanding. "You didn't stop back there, boy!" Hank barked, pointing behind him toward the empty road. David froze, startled. I did stop, sir," he said quickly, hands instinctively raised. "I just moved over here so I wouldn't block traffic. My wife's sick, and I was calling 'Don't talk back,'" Hank interrupted, his tone laced with disdain. "You were fleeing a lawful stop. That's resisting." The few customers scattered around the station looked up. A woman filling her SUV paused, watching nervously. A teenage boy inside the mini-mart pressed closer to the window, holding his phone but not daring to record yet. The only sound was the whir of the air conditioner vents from the store and the hum of an ice machine. David swallowed hard. "Sir, please. I wasn't running. I just needed step out of the vehicle. Now." David obeyed immediately. His knees felt weak as he stepped into the searing Sunday. The smell of gasoline mixed with sweat made the moment heavier, thicker. He kept his eyes on the ground, hoping submission would calm the situation. But Hank wasn't calming down. His tone got louder. "License and registration. Let's go." "They're in the truck, sir." "Can I?" "Don't move." David froze again, confused and frightened. The other customers were whispering now, exchanging glances, but staying silent. At the next pump, Keanu Reeves stood quietly beside a black SUV. Dressed in jeans and a faded gray t-shirt, he had been on the road most of the day, keeping to himself. He'd stopped for a quick fill-up and some cold water before heading toward Lubbock. His sunglasses hid the flicker of recognition in his eyes as he observed what was happening a few yards away. He'd seen this kind of scene before too many times on news headlines, too many clips that ended in tragedy. But this time, it wasn't on a screen. It was happening right in front of him. Keanu leaned against his car, hands resting loosely at his sides. He didn't interfere yet. He listened. He watched the tremor in David's hands, the officer's tight jaw, the imbalance of power hanging thick in the air. Then Hank's voice rose again, echoing off the gas pumps. "Hands behind your back." David blinked, startled. "Sir, I didn't do anything wrong." "You're disobeying a direct order," Hank barked, already stepping closer, one hand on his belt, the other hovering over his holstered weapon. The tension thickened instantly. A man near the air pump whispered, "This isn't right." But no one moved. No one dared. Keanu straightened slowly. The muscles in his jaw flexed. He'd seen fear before in war films, in disaster zones, but the fear on David's face was something deeper. It was the kind of fear born from being unseen, unheard, disbelieved your whole life. He looked around. No one was stepping in, not one person. Then, without haste, he took off his sunglasses and began walking toward the pumps. David's breath quickened. Hank's voice thundered again. I said hands behind your back. David's hands rose halfway, shaking uncontrollably. Please, officer, I didn't mean quiet, Hank snapped. His hand now gripped the cuff case, ready to swing it open. Keanu kept walking steady, calm, and unflinching. Each step made the crowd quieter, every head turning toward him. He didn't raise his voice, didn't posture. He simply moved with purpose. Hank noticed him approaching and barked, "Sir, stay back. This is police business." Keanu stopped a few feet away, his voice even, almost gentle. "I'm not interfering, officer," he said clearly. "I'm just observing." The tone was calm, but it carried a weight that cut through the chaos. The kind of tone that made everyone stop and listen. Hank frowned, confused by the calmness, by the presence of someone who didn't look afraid. He gestured sharply. "Then get back to your car before you're next." Keanu didn't move. His eyes locked on David, whose lips were trembling. Then, with quiet certainty, Keanu said, "Do you need a witness?" The sound of those 6 words changed the air around them. Everyone stopped breathing for a moment. The woman at the SUV lowered her phone. The teenager inside the store whispered, "Is that?" but didn't finish his sentence. Even Hank blinked, caught off guard. David looked at Keanu like a drowning man seeing a lifeline. His mouth opened, then closed again. Tears glistened in his eyes. The officer's hand slipped slightly from his belt. "What did you just say?" Keanu's voice stayed level. "I said, do you need a witness?" The sun burned hotter. The wind picked up dust across the lot. The tension was unbearable. A moment stretched thin between courage and disaster. And somewhere, in that unbearable silence, everything began to change. Hank's face hardened. His pride stung in front of watching eyes. "Sir, you need to leave now," he snapped, his voice tight. But the edge of control had already slipped from his grasp. Keanu didn't move. He stood under the relentless sun, his voice still quiet, steady as stone. "If this man has done something wrong, you'll have evidence on your camera. But if not, then we're all witnesses, aren't we?" The words carried more power than any shout could. The bystanders began filming openly now. A young mother whispered to her son, "Keep watching, honey. This matters." David's breath hitched. For the first time since the patrol car arrived, he felt something break through his fear-hope. His shoulders eased slightly. His trembling slowed. Hank glanced around. The phones, the eyes, the silent judgment, they cornered him more than any suspect could. His voice wavered. "Back away, both of you!" Keanu raised his phone slightly, the red light blinking. "Everything's being recorded, officer," he said evenly. "For everyone's protection." The line was simple, but it landed with precision. David looked at him and whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." Keanu nodded once, his expression unreadable. The sound of cicadas returned, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. No one spoke. Even Hank seemed trapped in the stillness he'd created. Then, finally, the officer lowered his voice. "You just made a big mistake, mister." Keanu didn't flinch. His gaze stayed locked. "The only mistake," he said softly, "is forgetting that justice belongs to everyone." The crowd stood frozen. Somewhere, a recording light kept blinking, and that was the moment the story truly began. For a long second, no one moved. The hum of the gas pumps filled the silence like background music to an invisible war. Hank's chest rose and fell rapidly, his authority slipping through his fingers as eyes turned against him. Keanu stayed still, a steady presence in the storm. His calmness made the officer's anger look smaller, almost childish. David stood frozen beside his old pickup, unsure whether to move or breathe. "Get back in your car," Hank muttered, his voice cracking now. "I'll let this go." Keanu didn't move. "You'll let it go," he repeated quietly, "because it was never yours to control." The words landed like thunder in the heat. Somewhere, a woman gasped. Another man whispered, "He's right." Hank took a step back, glancing toward his cruiser. His hand twitched near his radio. For a moment, it seemed like he might call for backup, but something in Keanu's stillness disarmed him completely. David's breath steadied. He glanced at Keanu again, and their eyes met, one filled with gratitude, the other with quiet reassurance. Finally, Hank turned away, muttering something no one could hear. He stomped back toward his car. The sound of his boots echoed across the concrete before the door slammed shut. No one cheered. No one clapped. They just watched as the patrol car rolled out of the lot, leaving a long trail of dust behind. David sank against his truck, overwhelmed. His eyes glistened as he whispered, "You didn't have to do that." Keanu gave a small, faint smile. "Maybe not," he said, voice low, "but sometimes silence does more harm than words." The two men stood there, side by side, the heat shimmering between them, one shaken, one steady. And somewhere above them, justice had just begun to breathe. The morning sun rose over the wide, open plains of western Texas, spilling golden light across endless miles of desert brush and telephone poles. The highway stretched like a ribbon into the horizon. Behind the wheel of a dark SUV, Keanu Reeves drove in, quiet thought, his hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, a travel mug of coffee beside him. He wasn't here for fame or business. No cameras followed him. No assistants trailed behind. He'd taken this trip alone on purpose. The Veterans Rehabilitation Center he supported outside Lubbock had just opened a new wing, one built entirely from private donations. Most of them came from him, but he never attached his name. He preferred it that way. He'd tell the press he was just visiting friends. As the radio hummed softly, Keanu's mind wandered to the people he'd met on the road. A diner waitress in Amarillo who'd lost her son in Iraq, but still smiled at every customer. A one-legged veteran who'd told him, "Sometimes peace ain't a place, it's a choice." Those encounters reminded him why he took these drives to stay connected to the real America. The one between cities and headlines. He didn't plan to stop for long today, just enough to refuel and stretch his legs. But fate, as it often did, had other plans. As he neared the outskirts of a small town, a green sign flashed by. Next gas, 2 miles. The needle hovered close to empty, so he flicked on his turn signal and pulled off the highway into a modest roadside station. The air shimmered with heat. The pumps looked old. The paint faded, but the place was quiet. He parked beside an empty pump and leaned back in his seat for a moment, letting the air conditioner hum softly. Through the tinted glass, he watched life unfold in slow motion, 2 kids tossing a football near the store, a delivery man carrying boxes, and a lone pickup truck pulling up beside another pump. The man behind the wheel looked tired. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his movements slow. Keanu noticed the small things, an old wedding ring, a lunch cooler in the passenger seat, the slump of someone carrying more than just physical exhaustion. Something about him felt familiar, not the face, but the weight behind it. Keanu had seen that same expression years ago, in his own father's eyes after a long day of defeat. He reached for his bottle of water, but before taking a sip, his attention sharpened. A flash of red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The hum of the engine outside changed tone as a police cruiser pulled into the station. Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't know yet what was coming, but his instincts told him to watch. Keanu turned off the ignition and sat still for a moment, the hum of the engine fading into the dry wind. Through the glass, he could see the reflection of the police lights bouncing off the truck's chrome. His pulse slowed as he watched the scene unfold. The officer stepped out with rigid posture, moving fast, barking something he couldn't hear yet. He didn't rush to intervene. Experience had taught him that jumping in without understanding made things worse. Instead, he observed. The man being questioned, David, looked nervous before a single word was even exchanged. His shoulders hunched defensively, his movements deliberate. He wasn't defiant, he was scared. Something in that fear took Keanu back to a night he'd tried to forget. He was a teenager then, riding with his father, Gerard Reeves, across the desert roads outside Phoenix. They were pulled over for a broken taillight. His father had done nothing wrong, but the officer's tone, the cold inspection of their car, the mocking smirk. When Gerard couldn't find his registration fast enough, it branded something in Keanu's memory. That sense of smallness, of being treated like you didn't belong, never left him. Years later, when Gerard passed, Keanu found an old friend letter folded in one of his books. It read, "Son, you can't fix every injustice, but if you ever see someone humiliated and you can't stop it, don't look away." He hadn't thought about that letter in years, but moments like this brought it back. David was still talking, hands trembling as he tried to explain something. The officer's tone sharpened, his gestures more aggressive. Keanu felt it, the shift from procedure to power. He unbuckled his seatbelt. The air outside shimmered with heat as he opened the door. A wave of warm air hit his face, thick with dust and gasoline. He adjusted his baseball cap, glanced once more at the scene, and stepped out. From a distance, he could hear fragments of the argument. "I stopped. Just wanted to call my wife. Don't talk back. Sir, please." Each word tightened the knot in his chest. Keanu looked around. A few bystanders stood frozen. One man recorded half-heartedly before lowering his phone. A woman at the cashier window frowned, but didn't step outside. It was that familiar paralysis, the instinct to stay uninvolved. Keanu took a breath, steadying himself. His calm had always been his strength. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply began walking toward the pump where everything was unraveling. For the first time, the officer turned and noticed him. His hand twitched toward his belt. Keanu stopped, just short of confrontation. Posture relaxed, tone measured. The officer's glare flicked toward him, irritated. "Move along, sir. This doesn't concern you." But Keanu already knew better. It did concern him, because injustice, no matter how small, always did. The officer's tone carried authority, but beneath it, Keanu sensed insecurity, the kind born from unchecked power. He didn't move. His eyes remained on David, who stood near his truck, his expression caught between confusion and fear. The man's voice cracked as he tried to speak, but every word seemed to make things worse. Keanu took another step forward, slow and deliberate, his voice steady. "Sometimes, sir, all it takes is a misunderstanding. Maybe we can clear it up." The officer gave him a sharp look. "And who exactly are you?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The badge on the officer's chest reflected the sunlight. It was enough to remind everyone who held the authority here. But power meant nothing if it lacked restraint. "I'm just a traveler," Keanu said finally. "Someone who doesn't like seeing things go wrong when they don't have to." The words hung in the air, soft but undeniable. The officer scoffed and turned back to David. "I told you to stop talking." David's hands shook. His knees nearly buckled. Keanu could feel the man's fear, the kind that came from knowing you had no control over what came next. He could have walked away, no one would have blamed him, but something deep inside refused to let him. He remembered his father's letter. He remembered the quiet humiliation that had burned into him that night years ago. Not this time. He turned his phone camera on, holding it low but visible enough. "For safety," he said calmly, addressing no one in particular. "For both of you." The officer turned again, eyes narrowing. "You recording me?" Keanu's tone didn't change. "Just documenting, in case things get misinterpreted." The phrase was neutral, yet it shifted the entire atmosphere. The other customers stopped pretending to ignore what was happening. A young man near the ice machine pulled out his phone. Another driver rolled down his window, recording quietly. The officer hesitated now, realizing the spotlight wasn't his to control anymore. Through the glass window of his pickup, David's reflection showed tears welling in his eyes. He whispered a prayer under his breath. Keanu stood firm, not confrontational but grounded, anchored in the quiet strength that defined him. The tension between them was a living thing, stretching tighter with every heartbeat. At that moment, Keanu didn't think about fame or risk or headlines. He thought about his father's voice, about the millions of moments when no one had spoken up. That's why he'd come to Texas, not to be seen, not to be honored, but to keep a promise made long ago, to never look away again. The sun burned overhead, a relentless white fire that made the pavement shimmer and the air tremble. The smell of gasoline and dust filled the station as Officer Hank Dobson's voice sliced through the heat. His tone wasn't just authoritative now, it was cruel. "Hands behind your back," he barked. "You're being detained for failure to comply." David Carter's heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the words. Sweat poured down his face as he raised his shaking hands, trying to speak. "Please, sir," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "I've been driving since early morning. My wife just had surgery. I didn't mean to do anything wrong." Hank ignored him. He grabbed David's wrist roughly, twisting his arm back. The movement was too fast, too hard. David winced, gasping from the pain. The sound drew murmurs from the small crowd forming near the convenience store doors. A young woman whispered, "He didn't do anything." But no one moved closer. The officer's voice grew louder, filled with anger and frustration that had nothing to do with the man he was holding. "When I give an order, you obey. You hear me?" David tried to nod, but his balance wavered. "Yes, sir. I please." Before he could finish, the officer shoved him toward the side of the truck, pressing his chest against the hot metal. David winced as the surface burned through his shirt. From the corner of the lot, Keanu Reeves opened his car door and stepped out. He didn't slam it, didn't shout. The door clicked softly, but that small sound drew every eye around him. He walked slowly, his movements controlled, one hand holding his phone, the other resting by his side. He didn't want a confrontation. He wanted truth. The light glinted off his phone as he started recording. His steps were calm, deliberate. The officer turned his head sharply. "Sir, back away," he snapped. "This doesn't concern you." Keanu stopped a few feet away, his voice quiet but steady. "It does when someone's being mistreated." The words cut through the tension like a blade through smoke. The officer blinked, caught off guard by the calmness. "You're interfering with law enforcement," he growled, his hand tightening on David's arm. Keanu kept his phone up. "I'm documenting," he said simply, "for everyone's safety." Something about that phrase, measured, unthreatening, shifted the air. The onlookers looked from Keanu to the officer, back to David, then to their own phones. One by one, screens began to light up as more people started recording. Hank felt the change, the loss of control. His eyes darted between them, irritation spreading like wildfire across his face. "You all think this is a show?" he shouted. "This man broke the law." Keanu's voice remained calm. "Then the video will prove that, won't it?" The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. David's breathing came ragged, the heat radiating off the truck, scorching his forearms. He whispered, "I didn't run, sir. I was just trying to find a safe spot to stop." But the words barely reached Hank. For a moment, everything hung in fragile balance. The officer's temper, the bystander's silence, and one man's quiet defiance holding it all together. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of unease. Every breath seemed to echo, every movement magnified. The scene had drawn nearly a dozen onlookers, their phones raised, but their bodies frozen in place, unwilling to cross that invisible line between witness and participant. Keanu stood right on that line, perfectly still. The reflection of red and blue lights flashed across his sunglasses. His phone camera stayed focused on the officer's hand gripping David's arm. The tremor in that arm was unmistakable, part fear, part pain. "Officer," Keanu said softly, "I think he's complying." Hank turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "You think you know how to do my part?" "Job, sir?" Keanu's tone didn't waver. "I don't. I just know what fairness looks like." The officer's jaw clenched. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Somewhere nearby, the sound of a soda can dropping echoed off the concrete. The tension in the air could have snapped with the faintest wrong word. David swallowed hard. "Please," he murmured, voice cracking. "My wife's waiting for me. Quiet," Hank snapped, giving his arm another shove. David grimaced in pain, his breath catching. That was the moment when something in Keanu's expression changed. It wasn't anger, just resolve. He took a slow step closer, making sure to stay clear of the officer's space but not retreating an inch. His phone stayed steady. "Officer, you're being recorded," he said quietly. "I'm sure you don't want this to escalate further." The words landed exactly as intended, not as a threat, but as a mirror. They forced Hank to see himself through the eyes of everyone watching. For a second, his grip loosened. He looked around and saw faces. Real people, real witnesses. It wasn't just Keanu anymore. There were at least 5 phones pointed in his direction, a silent chorus of accountability. The officer muttered, "You're all wasting your time," but the edge in his voice was gone. David turned his head slightly, tears streaking through the grime on his face. "I didn't mean any harm," he whispered again. Keanu's gaze softened. "We know," he said. The moment hung there, fragile and human. The officer's authority seemed smaller now, exposed to daylight and camera lenses. His voice faltered when he spoke again. "Step back, both of you." Keanu nodded once, but didn't move far. "I'll give you space," he said calmly, "but I'll stay right here." Something about that quiet presence, neither hostile nor submissive, disarmed the fury that had fueled the confrontation. Hank's posture stiffened, his breathing uneven. The weight of being watched began to settle on him. Inside the mini-mart, the cashier whispered into her phone, describing what was happening. The world was already starting to spread the story beyond that small gas station. The Texas wind picked up, scattering dust and wrappers across the pavement. And through the heat, Keanu remained an anchor of calm, his focus fixed on truth, not tension. Hank's voice cracked with anger that was quickly giving way to confusion. He had entered the scene, expecting submission, not resistance, especially not from a man who spoke without fear, without shouting, and yet commanded the moment entirely. Keanu stood motionless, recording. His voice stayed quiet, but every word he spoke reached the ears of everyone watching. "Officer, no one here wants trouble. We just want the truth." The officer's breathing grew heavier. "Truth?" he repeated, almost scoffing, but his voice lacked conviction now. "You think you understand what I deal with every day?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I understand people, officer, and I understand what it looks like when power goes too far." Those words weren't sharp, they were solemn, the kind that didn't attack, but pierced. For a moment, Hank said nothing. His hand lingered near his holster, not because he needed it, but because he didn't know what else to do with it. He glanced at David, who now stood still with his arms half raised, chest rising and falling rapidly, eyes filled with exhausted fear. "Sir," David whispered, "please, let me go home. My wife's waiting for me." The words broke something in the air. Keanu slowly lowered his phone, but he didn't stop recording. His tone softened even more. "He's done nothing wrong," he said gently. "Sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is admit when enough is enough." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hank's jaw tightened again, but the fight had left him. His grip finally released David's arm. "Get back in your truck," he muttered, his voice low and bitter. David nodded, nearly collapsing with relief as he stepped back. He rubbed his wrist, the red mark still visible against his skin. Keanu took one step closer to David, enough to place himself squarely between him and the officer. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who didn't need a badge to be respected. "You're safe now," he said. The crowd began to breathe again. The pressure lifted. Hank turned, pacing toward his patrol car, muttering curses to himself. The metallic slam of the car door sounded final. David looked at Keanu, disbelief and gratitude tangled in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, voice trembling. Keanu gave a faint smile. "You just did," he replied softly. Around them, the heat shimmered, and for the first time all day, silence felt like peace instead of fear. David's breathing came in shallow bursts, his mind spinning faster than his body could process. The burning sun felt like it was closing in on him, the smell of rubber and gasoline thick in the air. He looked at Keanu, desperate and trembling. His eyes were wide, silently begging for help. "Please," he whispered, barely audible. "I didn't do anything." Keanu nodded once, Calm and certain, I know. Those two words steadied David more than anything else could have. He clung to them like a lifeline. But before he could even breathe again, Hank's voice exploded behind him. "I said, hands behind your back!" The officer's shout cracked through the stillness like a whip. David flinched hard, turning halfway toward him. "Please, sir, don't talk," Hank yelled, pulling the handcuffs from his belt. The metal clanged loudly, the sound echoing across the open lot. It was the sound of power, of someone determined to prove a point, not uphold a law. Keanu's expression changed. He stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, just firm. His movement alone made several bystanders straighten their posture. Everyone could feel the shift. He raised his voice enough for everyone to hear, not shouting, but commanding. "Sir, I'm an American citizen, standing on public property, observing a traffic stop. That's my right." The words landed with weight, sharp and undeniable. They were calm, legal, and carried no threat. But they stripped away the officer's dominance in an instant. Hank turned toward him, the handcuffs still in his fist. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" "I'm not telling you how to do your job," Keanu said, his tone unwavering. "I'm reminding you that the law applies to everyone here, including you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone near the vending machine said, "He's right." A man in a delivery uniform took out his phone and started recording from another angle. Inside the gas station, a woman pressed her face to the window. Then, her voice rose, shaky but strong. "Leave that man alone!" The shout startled even David. It came from someone who had been silent only moments ago. But Keanu's courage had stirred something in her. Others began to whisper, their voices swelling with quiet outrage. The balance of power began to tilt. Hank could feel it, the loss of control, the questioning eyes on him, the sense that he'd gone too far. But his pride wouldn't let him stop. He sneered, stepping closer to Keanu. "You people always think you're the heroes," he said coldly. "You always play the victim." The sentence sliced through the air. Every word dripped with contempt. The crowd froze again. The only sound, the whir of an overhead air vent, and the distant hum of the highway. Keanu's jaw tightened. The kindness in his face hardened, not into anger, but into something far stronger resolve. His calm became steel. The words hung heavy in the scorching air, cruel and venomous. "You people always play the victim." It wasn't just an insult, it was a wound, sharp and deliberate. The small crowd fell silent again, the tension too thick to breathe through. Keanu's eyes stayed fixed on Hank. His tone didn't rise, but the firmness in his voice could have bent steel. "What exactly do you mean by you people, officer?" Hank shifted, suddenly aware that every camera was pointed straight at him. His mouth opened, but the words came slower now, less certain. "You know what I mean." "No," Keanu said softly, stepping closer, closing the distance inch by inch. "I don't think you do." The heat radiated between them like a living force. David stood still beside his truck, breathing hard, afraid to move. Every second felt like a lifetime. Hank's voice broke the silence again. "Sir, this is your last warning. You're interfering with police work." Keanu didn't blink. "And you're interfering with justice." The crowd reacted, a few gasps, a few murmurs. One man whispered, "He said it." Another added quietly, "Good for him." For the first time, Hank looked unsure. His stance wavered, not because of fear, but because he could feel the tide turning. The confidence that came from authority was slipping, replaced by a rising awareness that he was being watched, recorded, judged. Keanu's voice stayed calm, every word deliberate. "You're wearing that badge because this country trusts you to protect people. Not humiliate them, not intimidate them. Protect them." The officer's nostrils flared. "You're twisting this," he snapped, but the crack in his voice betrayed him. Keanu shook his head. "No, I'm reminding you." Another voice from the store called out again, firmer now. "He's right. We saw everything." Hank turned toward the sound, his temper flaring again, but something in Keanu's presence stopped him from charging forward. It wasn't fear, it was that steady, immovable calm that stripped away any justification he thought he had. David's voice trembled when he spoke. "Officer, please, I'm just trying to go home." The desperation in his tone silenced everyone again. It wasn't defiance, it was exhaustion. It was the sound of someone who'd been through this before, too many times. Keanu looked at him and gave the smallest nod, just enough to reassure him. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly. The words weren't loud enough for everyone to hear, but David did. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time, his eyes showed something more than fear, something close to relief. Keanu took a half step closer to Hank, not threatening, just anchoring himself there. "You've made your point, officer," he said. "Now let the man go." Hank's eyes flicked from Keanu to the phones, to the silent witnesses all around him. For the first time since he stepped out of his cruiser, he didn't know what to do. The stillness at the gas station felt suffocating. Even the sound of the pumps had stopped. Every eye was locked on the two men, one armed with authority, the other armed only with truth. Hank's face was flushed, his jaw tight with frustration. The grip on his cuffs weakened, then tightened again, as though he was fighting two instincts at once. One told him to assert dominance. The other whispered that he was already losing control. Keanu didn't move. He simply waited, his presence alone disarming. "Officer," he said quietly, "the cameras are rolling. Let them see the kind of man you are." The words were calm, but struck like lightning. Hank's eyes darted to the bystanders. Dozens of small red lights blinked back at him from raised phones. The sight turned his confidence into panic. "Everyone put those phones down!" he barked, his voice cracking. No one moved. A woman near the door of the convenience store crossed her arms. "Not a chance," she said firmly. "We've seen enough." David stood trembling, his lips quivering as he looked at Keanu. He still didn't fully understand what was happening, only that the stranger beside him was the only thing standing between him and disaster. Keanu turned slightly toward him, his tone softer now. "You're safe. Just breathe." David nodded, a tear streaking down his cheek. "I just wanted to go home," he whispered again. Keanu's gaze flicked back to the officer. "You heard him," he said. "Now, do what's right." For the first time, Hank didn't respond. His hand fell away from his belt. He looked down, the adrenaline draining out of him. His voice came out low, defeated. "Fine, you can go." David exhaled shakily, disbelief written across his face. He didn't move at first, afraid it was some kind of trick. Then Keanu gave him another reassuring nod. Slowly, David stepped back toward his truck. The crowd broke into quiet murmurs. The tension that had gripped them finally began to dissolve. Keanu lowered his phone but didn't stop recording. His tone stayed calm, almost gentle. "That's better. No one got hurt. That's all anyone wanted." Hank said nothing. He walked toward his cruiser, his shoulders tight, his pride collapsing in silence. David leaned against his truck, exhausted, wiping at his eyes. He looked at Keanu with gratitude so deep it didn't need words. Keanu met his gaze and said softly, "Sometimes, the strongest thing we can do is stand still." The onlookers watched him, speechless. They knew they'd witnessed something rare, quiet courage in its purest form. The heat shimmered around them, and the air felt thick enough to choke on. Keanu stood unmoving, his phone raised, the red recording light steady. The officer's chest rose and fell quickly, his frustration reaching its breaking point. David wiped at his forehead, trembling. His voice was small now, almost childlike. "Please, sir, I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just stopped to call my wife." Keanu glanced at him briefly and spoke in a calm, grounding tone. "Stay still. Let me handle this." David nodded weakly, clutching his shaking hands together. Keanu turned his focus back to Hank. His tone was level, professional, almost detached. "Officer, "Can you state your name and badge number for the record?" Hank froze. He hadn't expected that. "You'll get that from my lawyer," he snapped after a pause, his words dripping with sarcasm. The crowd murmured again. Someone whispered. "He didn't answer." Another added, "He's supposed to give it." Keanu didn't blink. "Then you'll have to explain to the public why you denied a basic request," he said softly. Those words landed heavier than any accusation. They weren't angry, just factual. But they hit Hank harder than a punch. The silence that followed was unbearable. The hum of the gas pumps, the buzz of cicadas, the faint rattle of a distant truck engine. It all seemed to magnify the stillness. The world had gone quiet to watch what would happen next. David took a step forward, his voice cracking. "I just wanted to call my wife," he said again, louder this time. His hands shook uncontrollably. "She just got out of surgery. I didn't do anything wrong." The raw honesty in his tone pierced through the air. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't defiant. It was the desperate cry of a man crushed by fear. For a split second, even Hank hesitated. His hand froze mid-motion. His eyes flicked between Keanu, David, and the phones recording every second of it. But instead of stepping back, he clenched his jaw tighter. "Turn around," he barked again. "Now!" David flinched as if struck. Tears rolled down his cheeks, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, just let me go." Keanu lowered his phone slightly, enough to see both men clearly in the frame. His tone softened, but gained weight. "Officer," he said evenly, "look at him. Does he look like a threat to you?" The question was simple, but it stripped away every defense the officer could hide behind. It wasn't a challenge, it was truth framed as compassion. Hank's eyes flickered. His voice faltered. For the first time since he'd stepped out of his cruiser, he had no answer. Hank's silence stretched across the gas station like a drawn-out storm. The crowd barely breathed. Even the cicadas outside seemed to pause in the heat. His face flushed red, caught between anger and shame, pride and uncertainty. Keanu didn't move. His voice stayed calm, steady as stone. "He's scared, officer, not dangerous. There's a difference." The officer's fingers twitched near his cuffs, still trying to hold on to control that had already slipped through his grasp. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he muttered through gritted teeth. "I'm not," Keanu said, his voice still even. "I'm asking you to see the man in front of you." David stood frozen, his breath shallow. His shirt stuck to his back with sweat. He looked small beneath the glare of the patrol car's flashing lights. "Please, officer," he said again, voice breaking. "She's waiting for me. She can't move around after surgery. I just needed to let her know I'm okay." That single line, so ordinary, so painfully human, hit everyone listening like a blow to the chest. The woman behind the store counter covered her mouth. The delivery driver lowered his phone slightly, tears threatening at the edges of his eyes. But Hank couldn't let go of his anger. He took one step forward, barking. "Turn around!" His voice was loud, but it trembled. It was no longer the voice of control, it was the voice of a man realizing he was wrong but refusing to admit it. Keanu's jaw tightened. "You've made your order clear," he said, still calm but more deliberate now. "And he's followed every one of them. There's nothing else for him to do but stand here and wait for you to see reason." The words hung in the air, unshakable. Hank's lips pressed into a hard line. "I don't need your lectures," he hissed. Keanu took a slow breath. "No lectures, just decency." The crowd murmured again. Someone said quietly, "He's right. Enough's enough." The balance had shifted entirely. What began as a routine stop was now something else, entirely a moral reckoning. Under the Texas Sunday, Hank turned toward Keanu again, searching for something to say. "You think because you're famous you can walk up here and tell me how to do my job?" Keanu's tone didn't change. "I think because I'm human, I can speak when another man's being mistreated." The line cut deep. It wasn't arrogance, it was truth, spoken plainly. David lowered his gaze, tears falling freely now. "Thank you," he whispered under his breath. Keanu didn't respond. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. The stillness that followed was heavy but alive, the moment just before something finally breaks. And when it did, it wouldn't be Keanu or David who broke. The moment teetered on the edge of collapse. Hank's jaw flexed, his chest heaving, his authority slipping from command to chaos. The eyes of strangers burned into him, their silence louder than protest. Every second stretched like an hour. Keanu stood tall, steady, and unafraid. He spoke softly, yet the words carried the force of conviction. "Officer, you've got a man who's done nothing but tell the truth. You've got witnesses, cameras, and the whole world watching. Ask yourself, what do you want this moment to say about you?" The question hung in the air, echoing across the lot. It wasn't a challenge, it was a mirror. Hank froze. For the first time, his breathing slowed. His hand dropped from the cuffs to his side. The power he'd clung to drained away, leaving only the man behind the uniform tired, cornered, and suddenly aware of what he'd become in the eyes of everyone watching. David stood motionless, afraid to move, afraid to speak. A tear slipped down his cheek and hit the sun-baked concrete. His voice cracked when he finally whispered, "I just wanted to go home." Those words, small, trembling, human, hit harder than any confrontation. The woman by the window started crying quietly. The delivery driver lowered his camera and wiped his face. Keanu took one step forward. "He's not resisting you," he said quietly. "He's pleading with you. There's a difference. One day, you might wish someone had stepped in for you, too." Hank swallowed hard, his throat tightening. The defiance in his posture melted away, leaving him hollow. He looked at David, really looked at him for the first time. The man wasn't a suspect or a statistic. He was a husband, trying to make it through the day. Finally, Hank muttered under his breath, "Fine, you can go." His voice was thin, almost broken. The sound of relief rippled through the crowd. Phones lowered, breaths released, hearts unclenched. David wiped his eyes, whispering a shaky thank you. Keanu gave a small nod, lowering his phone completely now. "That's the right call," he said gently. "No one's here to make enemies. Just to remind each other what right looks like." Hank turned away, his steps heavy. The crowd watched in silence as he walked back to his cruiser, pride trailing behind him like dust in the heat. David leaned against his truck, trembling but safe. And in the midst of that quiet, Keanu looked up at the blazing sky and thought, sometimes peace isn't silence, it's courage that refuses to look away. The low rumble of another engine broke the stillness. A second police cruiser pulled into the gas station, its tires crunching over gravel. The flashing lights washed red and blue across the asphalt, slicing through the heavy Texas heat. Everyone turned as the car door opened. From it stepped Officer Marisol Vega, her uniform crisp, her posture confident. She looked to be in her late 30s, with sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. The moment she stepped out, the energy in the air shifted again, this time toward order. She scanned the scene quickly, one trembling man leaning against his old pickup, one furious officer gripping his cuffs, and one calm stranger standing between them, holding a phone. Her voice was firm but composed. "What's going on here?" Hank was the first to speak. "This man refused to comply with a lawful stop," he snapped, pointing at David. "He resisted, so I was preparing to detain him until this," he gestured toward Keanu, "decided to interfere." Marisol's gaze slid toward Keanu, and for a brief second her eyes widened with recognition. She didn't react beyond that, but her voice softened slightly. "Sir, are you recording?" "Yes," Keanu said calmly. "For everyone's safety." Her expression remained unreadable, but she nodded. "All right, let's get the full story." David tried to speak, but his voice came out shaky. "I didn't resist," he said quietly. "I was scared, that's all." Keanu turned toward her. "He didn't resist, officer. He explained himself several times. I have everything on video." Hank frowned. "He's twisting it. The man was non-compliant from the start." Keanu raised his phone slightly. Would you like to see what actually happened? Marisol hesitated. Her instinct told her to support her fellow officer, but something in Hank's tone made her pause. She saw David's shaking hands, the redness on his wrist, the silent tears still clinging to his face. She finally nodded. Show me. Keanu handed her the phone. She played the clip, her eyes moving fast but focused. The video was clear, Hank shouting, grabbing, escalating every step of the way, while David's voice trembled in fear. The footage ended with Keanu's calm voice. Does he look like a threat to you? Marisol took a breath, lowering the phone. Her jaw tightened. That's not protocol, she said quietly. The crowd stirred again. Someone whispered. She saw it. Hank's face flushed deep red. You taking his side now? He snapped. You know how people twist things once cameras get involved. What I see is an officer losing control of a situation that didn't require force. The words cut deeper than any reprimand. The hierarchy had shifted. She looked at David again, still shaking, still too afraid to speak, and then back at Keanu. Everyone, stand down, she said finally. I'll handle this. Her voice carried authority, and everyone, even Hank, knew there was no room for argument. Hank's jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck stood out. His pride was bleeding through the silence, raw and obvious. You're undermining me in front of civilians, he muttered under his breath, his voice sharp but trembling. Marisol didn't flinch. No, she said. You did that to yourself the moment you stopped listening. Her tone wasn't angry, it was controlled. The voice of someone who'd had to clean up the messes of others before. Hank turned to her, fists curling. You weren't here, Vega. You didn't see how it started. She held up a hand. Then show me your body cam footage. You have it running, right? The silence that followed was the loudest sound yet. Every head turned toward Hank. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked down, avoiding her eyes. It was malfunctioning, he muttered. Keanu's brows lifted slightly. That's convenient, he said calmly. A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the crowd. Not mocking, just incredulous. Hank's face turned crimson. Watch it, superstar, he snapped. You think fame makes you untouchable? Keanu stayed still. His tone never changed. No. It just makes it harder to pretend no one's watching. Marisol's lips pressed together to keep from reacting. She turned back to Keanu and nodded slightly, a silent thank you for staying calm when the situation begged for anger. Then she faced Hank squarely. You're done here. Go sit in your cruiser. I'll take statements. Hank hesitated, torn between defiance and the chain of command. You're making a mistake, he said bitterly. No, she replied, her voice final. You already made it. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned away, muttering something under his breath as he stomped toward his car. The crowd watched him go, their earlier fear replaced by something else, vindication. Marisol exhaled slowly and looked back at David. Sir, she said gently, I'm sorry for what you've been through. Are you injured? David shook his head, his throat tight. No, ma'am, just shaken up. She nodded. That's understandable. Keanu lowered his phone. Thank you for stepping in, he said quietly. Her eyes softened. It shouldn't have had to come to that. For a moment, the chaos that had consumed the gas station felt distant, almost surreal. The crowd began dispersing slowly. Some nodded to Keanu in silent gratitude before returning to their cars. The heat still pressed down, but the tension had finally lifted. Marisol looked down at Keanu's phone again. Can you send me that footage? Of course, he replied. I'll forward it to your department. She paused, studying him for a second. You didn't have to get involved, you know. Most people wouldn't have. Keanu glanced toward David, who was now sitting on his truck bed, hands covering his face. Most people forget what it feels like to be powerless, he said softly. I couldn't. Marisol nodded. That's rare. She didn't need to say more. The respect in her tone said everything. The air around the gas station began to cool as the sun dipped slightly, long shadows stretching across the pavement. The chaos had ebbed, replaced by a quiet awareness that something bigger than a traffic stop had just happened. Marisol walked over to David, crouching slightly to meet his eyes. Her voice softened. "You did the right thing by staying calm," she said. "You didn't deserve what happened here." David's eyes glistened. "I didn't want any of this," he whispered. "I just wanted to go home to my wife." Marisol gave a small nod. "You will," she said, "but I'm going to take a short statement first. Then you're free to go." She glanced at Keanu again, who stood nearby, quiet and steady. His phone was still in his hand, screen dim now, but recording light still glowing faintly. He wasn't doing it for show. He was doing it to make sure truth couldn't vanish. Hank's cruiser sat idling a few yards away. The sound of the engine filled the silence like a reminder that pride dies slower than anger. Through the windshield, Hank stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Marisol turned back to Keanu. "I'll report this," she said. "The footage will go directly to internal affairs. What you did, it's going to matter." Keanu's eyes stayed on David, who sat wiping his face with the sleeve of his shirt. "It only matters if it changes something," he said. Her gaze followed his. "Maybe it will," she replied softly. "But someone had to start it." David lifted his head and met Keanu's eyes. "You didn't even know me," he said. "Why'd you do it?" Keanu gave a slat of a faint smile. "Because I've seen too many people look away." The words landed deep, echoing louder than the sirens ever had. Marisol straightened, turning back toward the small crowd that remained. "Everyone, thank you for staying," she said. "You can leave now. We've got it handled." One by one, people began dispersing. A few gave Keanu quiet nods as they passed gratitude unspoken but understood. Marisol slipped her notebook into her pocket and offered her hand to Keanu. "I'll make sure this doesn't disappear," she said. Keanu shook her hand firmly. "I believe you." As she walked back toward her cruiser, the last light of day reflected off the badge on her chest, bright and steady. For the first time that afternoon, the gas station was quiet again. But nothing about it felt the same. Keanu stood beside David's old truck, the phone still in his hand, the truth safely recorded, and the balance of power forever changed. The tension that had ruled the air slowly thinned as the last of the onlookers drifted away. The hum of engines faded into the distance, replaced by the low buzz of cicadas and the occasional clink of a gas nozzle. The sun had started to dip, softening the harsh light into something almost forgiving. Officer Marisol Vega walked toward Keanu, her expression composed but thoughtful. There was something in her eyes, professionalism mixed with a quiet recognition. She stopped a few feet away, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. "I recognize you," she said quietly, "but thank you for not using that." Keanu gave a faint smile. "Fame doesn't protect anyone from injustice," he said. "If I ever start thinking it does, I'll have stopped understanding what life really means." Her expression softened. "You'd be surprised how many people forget that." She looked around the now empty gas station, the remnants of chaos still clinging to the air. "This could have gone bad fast," she added. "You helped keep it from getting there." Keanu's gaze followed hers. "All I did was remind someone they were being watched," he said. "Sometimes that's enough to make a man think twice." Marisol nodded, then turned toward David, who was sitting on the curb beside his truck. His shoulders were slumped, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to steady his breath. His face was drawn and pale, and the weight of everything that had just happened seemed to crush him all at once. Marisol knelt beside him, pulling a small bottle of water from her belt pouch. "Here," she said gently, "take this." David blinked, hesitating before accepting it. He opened it slowly, taking small sips as though the act itself was foreign. "Thank you," he murmured. She studied him for a moment. "You didn't deserve that," she said softly. "None of it." David gave a bitter little laugh that died in his throat. "Happens all the time," he said. "Different day, different town." Keanu heard the words as he approached. He crouched beside them, resting one hand lightly on the curb. His eyes met David's, steady and sincere. "It shouldn't," he said quietly. David looked at him for a long moment, his eyes tired but searching. "But it does," he whispered. Keanu didn't argue. He just nodded, because he knew that sometimes silence was the only thing that could carry truth without breaking it. The three of them sat there for a long moment. The movie star, the shaken citizen, and the weary cop, each carrying a different kind of burden, bound together by one shared truth. What had just happened could never be unseen. The light shifted as the sun began its slow descent, casting the gas station in long shadows. The air, once tense with anger, now felt heavier in a different way, like everyone there was being forced to look inward. Marisol stood up, brushing dust from her knees, and looked toward Hank's cruiser. The engine was still running. Through the windshield, Hank sat gripping the wheel, his face red and distant. His mouth moved, muttering words no one could hear. He slammed his fist once against the steering wheel, then started the car and drove off abruptly, tires screeching against the concrete. The sound echoed for several seconds, then vanished into the stillness of the open road. Marisol watched him go, her expression unreadable. "He's not a bad man," she said finally, "but he's lost sight of why he wears the badge." Keanu looked at her, thoughtful. "Maybe he just forgot what it's supposed to mean," he said. She nodded slowly. "When I first joined the force, my father told me something I never forgot," she said quietly. He said, "The badge doesn't make you more powerful, it reminds you to protect those who have none. But somewhere along the way, some of us forget." Keanu studied her for a moment. "You didn't forget," he said. Her eyes softened. "Some days I almost do," she admitted. "But then I see something like this, and it shakes me back." David, still sitting on the curb, looked up. "You think anything will happen to him?" Marisol sighed. "Internal Affairs will review the footage," she said. "There'll be consequences, but whether it changes him, that's harder to say." David nodded, his hands wrapped tightly around the bottle. "I just want to get home," he whispered. "Tell my wife I'm okay. She worries if I don't call." "You will," Keanu said gently. "But maybe tonight, she'll hear a story about something good that came out of something terrible." David managed a weak smile. "You really think this will change anything?" Keanu looked toward the horizon, where the heat met the fading light. "Maybe not the world," he said, "but maybe one person, maybe one kid watching that video will grow up and decide to do better." Marisol watched him speak, and something in her expression softened into respect. "You sound like someone who's seen too much to still believe in hope," she said. Keanu smiled faintly. "Maybe that's exactly why I still do." The quiet between them was filled with meaning. Marisol extended her hand to David. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's get you home." He nodded, moving slowly, his body tired but lighter than before. Keanu stood beside him, ready to help if he stumbled. The gas station was nearly empty now, but the memory of what had happened there hung thick in the air. It would linger long after they left. David stood unsteadily, brushing the dust from his jeans. The exhaustion on his face mixed with something else, relief, faint but real. Marisol stayed close, steadying him with a gentle hand on his arm. "Take a few minutes before you drive," she said. "You've had enough shock for one day." He nodded, eyes glistening again. "Thank you," he whispered. "You're the first officer who's ever said that to me." Her gaze softened. "Then that's a problem with the system, not with you." Keanu stood a few feet away, his phone still recording the aftermath. The heat of the day had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet warmth that carried the scent of dust and engine oil. He slipped the phone into his pocket and exhaled, slowly. Marisol turned to him again. "You didn't have to stay this long," she said. "Most people would have left after the danger passed." "I couldn't," Keanu replied simply. "If I walked away now, it'd be like pretending it didn't happen." She nodded, understanding. "You'd make a good cop," she said, half smiling. He gave a soft laugh. "No, I just try to be a decent man." Her eyes held his for a moment before she looked away, scanning the now empty lot. "Decent men are rarer than heroes these days," she said quietly. Behind them, David crouched beside his truck, gathering the small things that had fallen out during the chaos. A phone charger, a receipt, his wife's photo in a plastic frame. He stared at it for a moment before whispering, "I thought I wasn't going to make it home." Keanu approached and crouched beside him. "You will," he said softly. "And when you do, tell her she married one of the strongest men in Texas." David smiled through his tears. "Strong?" he said. "I was terrified. That's what strength looks like," Keanu replied. "Doing what's right, even when you're afraid." Marisol stepped closer, hearing the words. "He's right," she said. "What happened today might just help others tomorrow." The three of them stood together in the fading light, an unspoken understanding binding them: a celebrity, a civilian, and a cop trying to do the right thing in a flawed world. In the distance, the wind picked up, carrying away the last echo of Hank's tires. The day had started with shouting, but it ended with something far quieter: truth and the fragile beginning of change. The Texas sky had turned a deep orange by the time Keanu finally pulled back onto the highway. The gas station faded into the distance behind him, swallowed by heat and dusk. The hum of the tires on asphalt filled the silence inside his SUV. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't need noise. The images replayed on their own: the trembling man, the fury in the officer's eyes. The moment everything shifted, his phone buzzed on the seat beside him. Dozens of missed calls and messages glowed on the screen, most from unknown numbers. Someone must have recognized him despite the hat and sunglasses. He ignored them all. Instead, he opened his encrypted chat with a journalist friend he'd known for years, Sarah Bennett, a woman who had built her career exposing misconduct, but who understood discretion better than anyone else. He sent a single text: "Footage from Texas today. Upload anonymously. Protect the man involved." Then he attached the video file and hit send. No caption, no hashtags, just truth. Sarah's reply came within minutes. "Got it. You did the right thing, Keanu." He typed back, "Don't use my name." Then he turned off his phone and kept driving. The road stretched endlessly ahead, glowing faintly in the fading light. Somewhere beyond that horizon was the Veterans Rehab Center he'd been heading toward, all along a place where broken people rebuilt themselves piece by piece. Somehow, it felt fitting that his path had crossed with another man just trying to survive his own kind of battle. Hours later, while Keanu was still driving through the desert darkness, the video surfaced online. The first upload came from a small, independent news blog that Sarah often worked with. The headline was simple but explosive: "Hollywood actor intervenes in police harassment incident." Within an hour, it spread across platforms. Major outlets picked it up. Social media feeds flooded with clips, and hashtags began. Trending: number Be the Witness, number Justice in Texas, number Stand with David. The clip lasted only 2 minutes, but it captured everything: the officer's aggression, the trembling in David's hands, and Keanu's calm voice saying, "Do you need a witness?" It was raw and unfiltered, the kind of footage that couldn't be argued away. By midnight, millions had seen it, comment sections filled with outrage, tears, and gratitude. Civil rights organizations demanded a full investigation into Officer Hank Dobson's conduct. Lawyers offered to represent David for free. Even police officers from other states commented, acknowledging that what they'd seen was not procedure and not justice. Meanwhile, Keanu avoided the chaos entirely. His phone stayed off, his car moving steadily through the darkness toward his quiet destination. He didn't want the story to become about him. He wanted it to stay where it belonged, with the man who'd been afraid, and with the message that everyone had the power to make a difference if they refused to look away. As he drove, the desert wind rattled against the windows. He thought of his father's letter again, the one he'd kept all these years. "If you ever see someone humiliated, and you can stop it, don't look away." He smiled faintly in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. Somewhere out there, people were watching the same moment that had changed everything. By dawn, the story had crossed every major network. Morning talk shows replayed the footage between headlines, dissecting every frame. Legal analysts debated the boundaries of civilian oversight, while activists called it a turning point. Even without Keanu's name attached, his voice and posture were unmistakable. It didn't take long before viewers connected the dots. News anchors described it as a masterclass in calm courage. One host said, He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he just stood there, and that made all the difference. Another added, "If more people acted like this, we might start seeing real accountability." The viral wave hit every corner of the internet. On social media, hashtags continued to grow. Number Be the Witness became more than a trend. It turned into a movement. People began sharing their own videos of standing up against injustice, small acts of decency that echoed the moment from Texas. Somewhere outside of Lubbock, Keanu stopped at a rest area to refuel and grab coffee. He glanced at a nearby television through the diner window, where his own image played silently on the screen. The footage looped again and again, that same calm moment frozen in time. He shook his head and turned away. He hadn't wanted the attention. He hadn't wanted to be the story. He sat at a booth with a steaming cup of coffee, the sunlight just beginning to break over the horizon. A truck driver sitting nearby glanced at him, eyes widening in recognition but said nothing. After a few seconds, the man nodded quietly. No words, just respect. Keanu returned the nod and smiled faintly. When he finally turned his phone back on, it lit up with hundreds of notifications, calls, messages, mentions. He ignored most of them, until one name stopped him cold: David Carter. The message was short, written with shaky punctuation, but clear intent. "If you hadn't stopped that day, I might not be alive. I don't know how to thank you. My wife cried when she saw the video. She said you gave her husband back to her. God bless you, Mr. Reeves." Keanu stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "You don't owe me anything, David. Just live your life." That's thanks enough. He put the phone down and looked out across the endless highway. The sun had risen fully now, painting the desert in gold. He thought about how small the act had felt in the moment, one man refusing to walk away. Yet here it was, rippling outward, reaching people he would never meet. Later that morning, as he pulled into the Scrabs parking lot of the Veterans Rehab Center, one of the nurses waiting outside called out, "Mr. Reeves, you saw the news? You're trending worldwide." He smiled gently. "Yeah," he said, "but let's keep it quiet, all right?" Inside, he spent the next few hours meeting with patients, shaking hands, listening to their stories. No cameras, no headlines, just the work that mattered. As he left, he looked up at the American flag fluttering over the entrance. For the first time that week, he felt peace. Because it wasn't about him. It was about the man who'd made it home, the truth that had been seen, and the reminder that even one small act of courage could still change the world. The video's momentum showed no signs of slowing. Within 48 hours, the Texas Department of Public Safety formally announced an internal investigation into Officer Hank Dobson's conduct. The statement, brief but firm, promised a full review of the incident and immediate administrative action. Reporters crowded outside the Lubbock precinct, cameras flashing as officers hurried past. For the first time in his career, Hank was suspended pending review. Marisol Vega's testimony matched the footage exactly. She confirmed that David Carter had not resisted, that Keanu Reeves had remained calm, and that the escalation had been unnecessary. Her statement was read aloud during the press briefing, her words clear and measured. "De-escalation is a duty," she said, "not an option." The phrase spread almost instantly. It appeared in headlines, editorials, and protest signs. Keanu's quiet stand had sparked something far larger than the three people at that gas station could have imagined. Television networks couldn't stop talking about it. Morning shows debated endlessly. Was Keanu's action civic courage or celebrity privilege? Some argued that people only paid attention because he was famous. Others countered that his fame wasn't the story. It was his silence, his composure, his refusal to look away. Clips of his calm voice circulated online. People looped the moment he said, "Do you need a witness?" It became more than a question. It became a statement of solidarity. Under the pressure of national outrage, DPS released a preliminary report confirming multiple violations of conduct. Hank had failed to activate his body cam, used unnecessary force, and neglected to follow verbal de-escalation protocol. The announcement was met with applause on social media. Civil rights groups praised the swift response, calling it a rare moment of accountability. Meanwhile, Keanu's name was on every channel, though he still refused all interview requests. His publicist fielded hundreds of calls from major networks, all wanting an exclusive statement. He sent only one short response through his representative. "It wasn't about fame," the statement read. "It was about decency. We can't fix injustice by looking away." The line struck a nerve. It was quoted on evening news broadcasts, printed on posters, and even used in classrooms discussing ethics and social responsibility. Talk show hosts repeated it with admiration. Politicians tweeted it. It became a rallying quote for anyone who had ever witnessed wrongdoing and wondered whether stepping in was worth the risk. Back in Houston, David Carter was trying to return to normal life, though normal no longer felt the same. He received hundreds of messages from strangers, people thanking him for his courage, people sharing their own stories of fear, humiliation, and survival. Some wrote just to say they believed him. One message read, "You made me feel seen." David read that one twice, then again before bed. For the first time in years, he felt like the world wasn't just watching him, it was listening. News outlets across the country ran continuous coverage as the investigation deepened. For the first time, the public saw the system move with visible urgency. DPS confirmed that Officer Hank Dobson had been placed on unpaid suspension pending the outcome of the inquiry. While some officials called it temporary, others hinted privately that his career in law enforcement might be over. Hank, once respected among his peers, now faced cameras outside his home instead of salutes at the precinct. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains as he drove away each morning, expression blank, avoiding the reporters waiting near his driveway. His silence said more than any statement could. Pride had given way to isolation. Inside the DPS headquarters, Marisol Vega sat in a closed-door meeting with investigators. She laid out every detail of what she weighed down, saw, backing each point with Keanu's footage. The investigators asked question after question, but her answers never changed. "The civilian did not resist," she said. "The escalation was unnecessary." The second officer arrived and restored order within protocol. Her words carried weight because they came not from a celebrity or a bystander, but from someone inside the system, a voice that couldn't be dismissed. When she left the room, one of the senior officers reportedly told her, "Vega, you just helped save this department's integrity." Meanwhile, across the internet, the story refused to fade. A small quote from Keanu's brief statement had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't about fame. It was about decency. Those 8 words became a headline on every major outlet. They were printed on t-shirts, spray-painted on murals, and posted across platforms under the hashtag number Decency Matters. Commentators called it the moment America remembered what conscience looks like. Keanu, however, remained invisible through it all. He turned down interviews from CNN, BBC, and dozens of podcasts. He refused invitations to award ceremonies honoring acts of civic bravery. Instead, he quietly continued his travels through the Southwest, stopping at small shelters and community centers. When a local reporter finally caught up with him in Albuquerque and asked about the video, he simply smiled and said, "The only part that matters is that someone felt seen." Then, he got back into his SUV and drove away. For David, the world had changed in ways he couldn't have imagined. His phone filled daily with messages from strangers, some encouraging, some heartbreaking. A retired veteran wrote, "I've been in your shoes, brother. You showed more restraint than most could." A single mother in Georgia messaged, "My son watched that video and said, 'That could have been you, Mom. Thank you for surviving.'" Churches, civic organizations, and even small-town police reform groups reached out, offering help, support, and platforms for him to share his story. At first, David hesitated. He wasn't a speaker, just a working man. But his wife, still recovering from surgery, convinced him. "They're not just listening to you," she told him. "They're listening because of you." So, David began writing small posts about empathy and fairness. Nothing grand, just his truth. "I used to think my voice didn't matter," one post read. But maybe silence was what kept things broken for so long. His words reached thousands, then tens of thousands. Meanwhile, Marisol was invited to a statewide conference on police ethics, where she spoke publicly for the first time. Standing behind the podium, she said, "What happened at that gas station wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of restoration." A citizen reminded a public servant what the badge stands for. Her remarks drew a standing ovation. That night, clips of her speech aired alongside Keanu's quote, the two voices harmonizing across newsrooms and social media alike. People began to see that courage didn't always come from confrontation. It often came from stillness, from choosing to stand when walking away was easier. And through it all, David Carter, a man who once felt invisible, became a symbol of something bigger than pain. He became proof that one man's dignity, when defended, could inspire millions to look again at the world around them. The week after the investigation began, David Carter's life changed in ways he never imagined. For years, he had lived quietly working, paying bills, keeping his head down. He had learned the hard way that staying invisible was sometimes safer than being seen. He had been a mechanic for almost 20 years, good at his job, known for fixing things that other people gave up on. He worked out of a small garage behind a grocery store in Abilene, charging less than the big shops because most of his customers were working people like him. He was proud of that. But behind the grease and the steady hands was a man who had carried the same scar for decades, an arrest record that never should have existed. It happened years ago, when he was 21. His car had broken down on the side of the road just outside Dallas. He was waiting for a tow truck, standing under a streetlight, when a patrol car pulled up. The officer asked what he was doing there. David explained, even showed his phone where the tow confirmation message glowed. The officer didn't care. He accused him of loitering, ordered him to sit on the curb, and by the end of the night, David was fingerprinted and photographed for a crime that didn't exist. He spent one night in a holding cell, humiliated, watching other men sleep on cold benches. The charges were dropped the next day, but the record lingered, staining his background checks, costing him jobs and dignity. That experience taught him to keep his head down, never argue, never attract attention. For years, he lived that way, quiet, cautious, invisible. Even his wife Sharon once told him, "You're too careful, David." And he'd always answer the same way. Careful keeps us safe. But after the gas station, careful no longer felt like enough. In the days following Keanu's intervention, journalists began reaching out, not for scandal, but for understanding. They wanted to know who the man in the video was, the one with trembling hands who had faced down injustice without fighting back. At first, David refused. He didn't want attention. But then he thought about his daughters, Danielle, 17, and Maya, 12. He wanted them to grow up in a world where standing tall wasn't a risk. When a small local radio station invited him to speak, he hesitated. Then Sharon placed her hand over his and said, "They're finally asking to hear your story. Don't let fear be louder than your truth." So he agreed. The radio studio was small, its walls lined with faded soundproof foam. The host, a middle-aged man named Tom Greer, greeted him with a kind smile and a handshake. "Mr. Carter," he said, "people have been moved by your story. They've seen the video, but they haven't heard from you. You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to, but I think the world could use your voice." David adjusted his chair in front of the microphone. His heart pounded, his palms slick with sweat. "I'm not used to talking much," he said with a nervous laugh. Tom smiled. "You don't have to perform, just speak from the heart." The red recording light blinked on. Tom began softly. "We're here today with David Carter, the man at the center of a story that's brought the nation to attention." David took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he didn't hide behind silence. The studio was quiet, except for the low hum of the microphones. David took another breath, his voice shaking slightly as he began. "I'm just a mechanic," he said. "A husband, a father. I wasn't looking for trouble that day. I just wanted to get home to my wife after her surgery." He paused, his throat tightening. "When that officer stopped me, I didn't think about anything except surviving. You learn to keep your voice low. You learn not to move too fast. You learn that the wrong word can turn a bad situation worse. Tom nodded quietly, letting him continue. David's eyes glistened under the fluorescent lights. But then, someone stepped in. A stranger. I didn't even know who he was at first. He just stood there and said, "Do you need a witness?" His voice broke. He took a slow breath before continuing. That man didn't just record a video. He recorded my humanity. He made sure the world saw me as a person, not a threat. The host sat silently for a moment, visibly moved. "That's powerful, David," he said softly. "How has life changed since then?" David smiled faintly, shaking his head. "People talk to me differently now. I get messages from folks I've never met. They say they see themselves in me. Some say they've gone through worse. I just tell them I didn't do anything special. I just didn't want to die. Misunderstood." He paused again, his voice gentler now. "But I think about that day every time I look at my daughters. They saw it too. And now, when they look at me, I see pride in their eyes, instead of fear. My youngest told me last night, 'Daddy, you didn't just fix cars. You fixed something bigger.'" Tom smiled. "You're giving people hope, David. You're reminding them that ordinary people can still teach the world extraordinary lessons." The red light blinked off, signaling the end of the recording. Tom reached across the table and shook David's hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You reminded us all why doing the right thing still matters." Later that evening, the segment aired across Texas. Sharon and their daughters sat together on the worn living room couch, listening as David's voice filled the room. When he spoke those words, that man didn't just record a video. He recorded my humanity. Sharon felt tears spill down her cheeks. She reached for his hand and whispered, "Finally, they see you." David didn't speak. He just looked at his family, his heart full, his eyes wet with gratitude. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel invisible anymore. He felt seen. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away, Keanu Reeves sat alone in a quiet motel room, watching the same interview on a small TV. When he heard David's words, he smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "That's all that mattered." A week after the video went viral, the fluorescent lights of the Lubbock Police Department's Internal Affairs hearing room flickered softly against gray walls. The room was sterile, silent, and colder than the air outside. Officer Hank Dobson sat at the end of a long conference table, his uniform pressed, his shoulders slumped. Across from him sat 3 members of the Disciplinary Review Board and his direct supervisor, Captain Reed, a veteran officer with decades of service etched into his face. The air was heavy with judgment before anyone spoke. A monitor on the wall froze on the image everyone in Texas had already seen 1,000 times. Hank standing over David Carter, shouting, while Keanu Reeves calmly recorded nearby. The playback began. The sound of Hank's voice filled the room, harsh and echoing. "You people always play the victim." The words landed differently now. Without the heat of the moment, they sounded smaller, cruel, defensive, and unmistakably ugly. Hank shifted in his seat, staring at his hands. He had heard those words replayed on national television, dissected by journalists and activists alike. But hearing them in that sterile room, surrounded by silence, stripped away the last of his denial. When the video ended, no one spoke for a long time. Captain Reed finally broke the silence. "Officer Dobson," he said evenly, "do you realize how much harm you caused?" Hank swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. "I didn't mean he started," but Reed cut him off. "It doesn't matter what you meant. It matters what you did. That man will remember your face for the rest of his life. So will every person who saw this video. You didn't just humiliate him, you humiliated this department." Hank's eyes stayed fixed on the table, his hands clenched together, his knuckles white. He wanted to argue, to explain that he had been under stress, that the job had changed, that no one understood what officers faced out there. But every excuse felt hollow. Another board member, a woman in her 60s named Lieutenant Harper, leaned forward. "The department has received hundreds of complaints demanding your termination, but the law gives us a process, and we're following it. You're suspended without pay for 60 days, pending completion of mandatory sensitivity and de-escalation training. After that, we'll reassess your position." Her tone was professional but final. Hank's stomach sank. 60 days without pay meant financial strain he couldn't afford. But worse than that was the word that clung to the air sensitivity training. It wasn't just punishment. It was humiliation. He nodded stiffly. "Understood." Captain Reed folded his hands. "You'll also make a formal apology to Mr. Carter. Whether he accepts it or not is up to him, but you'll write it, and you'll mean it." Hank didn't argue. He simply muttered, "Yes, sir." The hearing adjourned after only 20 minutes, but to Hank, it felt like an eternity. He stood slowly, his badge heavy on his chest, the weight of accountability pressing harder than the uniform he once wore with pride. As he left the room, the last thing he saw was the still frame on the monitor himself, frozen mid-yell, eyes full of anger. A version of himself he didn't recognize anymore. Outside the department building, the Texas sun beat down hard, but Hank felt cold. He walked across the parking lot in silence, his badge heavy in his pocket. His career 25 years of service had unraveled in less than a week. For years he had believed authority gave him strength. Now he understood that it had blinded him instead. At home, the blinds were drawn. His wife Linda sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. Her eyes flicked up briefly as he entered. "They're talking about you again," she said quietly. "It's everywhere. The news, the internet, even church people are sharing it." Hank sank into a chair, exhausted. "I know," he muttered. "They played the hearing on TV." Linda's voice trembled slightly. "Hank, why did you say that? You people always play the victim? You've never talked like that before." He rubbed his temples. "I don't know," he whispered. "I was angry, tired. I let it get personal." She didn't respond for a moment. "You embarrassed this family," she said finally. "But maybe it's not too late to fix it." He looked up at her, eyes bloodshot. "How do you fix something like that?" She slid a folded letter across the table. "Start here," she said. "Write what you should have said that day." Hank unfolded the paper. It was blank. For the first time in days, he felt tears sting his eyes. He picked up a pen and began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster, almost like confession. He wrote about the years he'd spent building walls instead of bridges, the bitterness that had grown each time he felt disrespected, and how he'd mistaken fear for control. When he finished, he looked down at the page and whispered, "I'm sorry, David Carter." A week later, his letter appeared in the local paper. The editors didn't sensationalize it. They printed it in full, unedited. The first line read, "I was wrong. No man deserves to be treated that way." The letter spread quickly online. Some readers called it redemption. Others called it too late. But to those who mattered most, the people who had suffered silently, it felt like a small victory. Marisol read it during her lunch break and sighed softly. "Maybe accountability isn't about punishment," she said to a fellow officer. "Maybe it's about learning how to face yourself." As for Keanu, he never mentioned Hank's name again. He didn't comment on the apology or the investigation. When asked about it months later at a charity event, he simply said, "It's not about who fell, it's about who gets up." Different. In the end, Hank Dobson kept his job, though his authority would never feel the same. The man who once barked orders now listened first. He still wore the badge, but now it carried weight for a reason he finally understood. The early morning light spilled across the floor of Keanu Reeves' quiet Los Angeles home. It was one of those rare mornings when he wasn't on set, wasn't attending an event, and didn't have his phone buzzing with messages. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and walked out to the small wooden table near the window. Among the usual stack of mail scripts, charity requests, and fan letters was a plain white envelope. No return address, no printed label, just a handwritten name across the front, Mr. Keanu Reeves. The handwriting was neat, but slightly shaky, the kind that spoke of someone unaccustomed to writing letters anymore. Curious, he tore it open carefully and unfolded the page inside. The paper was creased, the ink slightly smudged in places. As he began to read, his quiet morning faded into silence. "Mr. Reeves, I don't know if you'll read this, but I wanted to say thank you. You didn't just save me from an officer, you saved me from believing the world didn't care. For a long time, I thought my life didn't matter much. That day at the gas station, when you stepped forward, you didn't just defend me, you reminded me that people still see me." Keanu paused, staring at the words. The handwriting carried the weight of honesty that no typed message could ever hold. He continued reading slowly. "My wife has been recovering from surgery. She saw the video too. She cried, not just because she was afraid, but because for the first time, she saw someone stand up for her husband. My daughters told me I looked brave on TV, even though I was terrified. They said, 'Daddy, that man believed in you.'" The next lines were underlined. "You gave me something I didn't know I'd lost a reason to trust." Again, "My kids sleep easier now. My wife smiles more. You reminded us that good still exists in the world." The letter ended simply, "With gratitude, David Carter." Keanu read it twice, then folded it gently, almost reverently. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of birds outside. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed for a moment, letting the words sink in. He didn't think of the viral video, the headlines, or the praise. Those things had come and gone. What mattered was this: a man he'd met by chance, alive and healing, surrounded by his family. He reached into his jacket hanging on the chair beside him, slid the letter into the inner pocket, and pressed his hand against it for a moment. It felt heavier than paper should. That morning, as he stepped outside and looked up at the California sky, he smiled quietly to himself. Some things didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Later that afternoon, Keanu sat in his garden, surrounded by the faint hum of Los Angeles traffic and the gentle rustle of leaves. He held David's letter in his hands again, rereading every word as sunlight filtered through the trees. Each sentence seemed to carry more weight than the first time. It wasn't just gratitude, it was healing, written on paper. He thought about how small the moment at that gas station had been in real time. A decision made in seconds. A step forward instead of staying still. But sometimes, the smallest acts left the longest echoes. He reached for a pen and a piece of stationery, not the printed kind with his name or logo, just a blank sheet. After a moment of hesitation, he began to write. "David, your letter found me on a quiet morning, and it reminded me why silence is never the answer when someone is suffering. You didn't owe me thanks, but I owe you respect for your strength, your grace, and the way you faced fear without losing your dignity." He paused, then continued. "You've carried a weight most people don't see, yet you never let it turn your heart bitter. That's courage, David. Real courage. The world needs more of that. Please tell your daughters that I think their father is one of the bravest men I've ever met. And tell your wife that her faith, even through hardship, is what holds the world together. I didn't save you. You reminded me what decency means." He signed it simply, "With respect, Keanu." He folded the note, slipped it into an envelope, and set it aside to be mailed the next day. For a while, he just sat there, watching the light shift across the yard. The world outside was loud again, reporters still debating, new headlines spinning, but he had no urge to respond. The real story wasn't on television anymore. It was in 2 handwritten letters that crossed paths between a mechanic in Texas and an actor in Los Angeles. That night, Keanu went for a drive. The city was quiet under the glow of streetlights. He stopped at a red light, his fingers brushing against his jacket pocket, feeling the folded paper inside. The letter wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder that the smallest choices could still ripple through a broken world. He thought about his late father again, the man who had once taught him never to turn away from someone being humiliated. The memory surfaced, like a whisper from years past. If you can stop harm, even for one moment, you do it. That's how you stay human. At that red light, Keanu understood that those words had come full circle. When the light turned green, he smiled faintly and drove on. Somewhere miles away, David Carter would open his mailbox in a few days and find an envelope without return address or signature beyond a simple name. Inside, he would find more than a reply. He would find proof that kindness travels both ways. In the quiet of that moment, Keanu realized that not every story needed an audience. Some were meant to live quietly between hearts that had once shared the same silence, the same fear, and the same hope. He turned off the radio and rolled down the window. The night air was cool against his face. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like an actor or a public figure. He just felt human, exactly the way David's letter had intended him to feel. It was late summer when Keanu Reeves returned to Texas. The sky was wide and cloudless, the heat shimmering across the highway like a mirage. He wasn't there for publicity or a film project. He came alone. No entourage, no cameras, just his motorcycle and a quiet need to revisit the place where a single moment had changed so many lives. As he turned off the interstate, the familiar gas station came into view, sitting quietly beneath the same faded sign. It looked almost unchanged, the cracked pavement, the humming fuel pumps, the smell of sun-baked asphalt. But something about it felt different, lighter. The tension that had once filled this place had been replaced by something more human. He parked his motorcycle and removed his helmet. The air was thick and warm, the kind that clung to your skin. When he stepped inside the small convenience store, the sound of a bell jingled over the door. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with a kind smile and a slightly graying beard. The man looked up and froze for a second, eyes widening. "Wait, you're..." Keanu raised a hand, smiling gently. "Just passing through," he said. The man chuckled softly, his surprise turning into warmth. "You know, people still talk about that day," he said. "That gas station out there, it became kind of a landmark. Folks stop here just to ask where it happened. Some even take pictures." Keanu looked through the window at the spot near the pumps, the same one where David's trembling hands had held the steering wheel, where he had asked that simple question that rippled across the nation. "I guess it wasn't about where it happened," he said softly. "It was about why." The owner nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, maybe so. But I'll tell you this, the folks around here remember. Not just what you did, but how calm you were. It changed how people think about standing up for one another." Keanu smiled faintly, gratitude flickering behind his eyes. He didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded. Outside, the sun hung low, blazing across the horizon. As Keanu walked toward his motorcycle, a familiar sound drifted through the air in the rumble of an old pickup truck. He turned toward it instinctively. The old Chevy rolled to a stop near the same pump it had years before. David Carter stepped out, wearing a clean button-down shirt and jeans. He looked healthier, stronger. The lines of worry softened on his face. When he spotted Keanu, his eyes widened with disbelief, then softened into something deeper gratitude mixed with quiet joy. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his voice full but calm this time. "I can't believe this." Keanu smiled, walking closer. "Hey, David," he said. "It's good to see you." David shook his head, still processing the moment. "You came back," he said quietly. "Just passing through again," Keanu replied with a small grin. The two men stood there in the same Texas heat, the same stretch of ground where fear had once taken over. Only this time, there was no shouting, no tension, just peace between them. For a long moment, they simply stood there, both remembering without speaking. The hum of the pumps filled the silence. A breeze drifted through, carrying the faint scent of gasoline and wild grass. David broke the silence first. "I wanted to tell you this in person," he said. "That day, it didn't just save me. It changed everything. I stopped being afraid to live. I stopped feeling invisible." Keanu nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "I didn't do much, David. You stood your ground. I just witnessed it." David shook his head. "You did more than you know. After that day, I started volunteering at a youth center, talking to kids who've had run-ins with the law, helping them get jobs, giving them a voice. I tell them about that day sometimes not to make them angry, but to show them that calm and truth can be stronger than rage." Keanu smiled, genuinely moved. "That's the best kind of change," he said, "when one good thing becomes many." David looked out toward the horizon, the light glinting off his truck. "You know, I used to hate driving past this place," he said softly. "Now it feels different. I bring my daughters here sometimes. I tell them this is where I met a man who made me believe in justice again." Keanu's gaze drifted toward the same pump. "Justice isn't about punishment," he said quietly. "It's about remembering who we're supposed to be." David turned back toward him, his expression steady. "You gave me that reminder." They stood in silence again, but this time it was peaceful, like the earth itself was finally exhaling. The afternoon light wrapped around them, the same sun that had burned so harshly that day now feeling warm, even forgiving. Finally, David extended his hand. "I never got to thank you properly," he said. Keanu clasped his hand firmly. "You just did." The handshake lingered, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. Two men who had met by chance, bound by a moment that would outlive both of them. A car horn sounded faintly from the highway, breaking the stillness. Keanu smiled. "Take care of yourself, David. Keep helping those kids." "I will," David said, smiling back. "And if you ever find yourself near Abilene, you've got a place at our dinner table." Keanu chuckled softly. "I'll hold you to that." He stepped back toward his motorcycle, slipping on his helmet. As the engine rumbled to life, David raised a hand in farewell. Keanu nodded once before driving off, the wind tugging at his jacket as the gas station grew smaller in the mirror. The same road stretched ahead of him, but it didn't feel empty anymore. Somewhere behind him, a man and his family were living proof that decency could still rewrite a story. Under that same blazing Texas sun, peace had finally replaced fear. Months passed, but the story of that afternoon in Texas didn't fade, it grew. What began as a single act of courage on a blistering summer day became a movement that reached far beyond that dusty roadside. At a university in Austin, a young law student named Rachel Kim sat in a crowded lecture hall, her laptop open to a news article about the gas station incident. The line that struck her most wasn't about Keanu Reeves' fame. It was his quiet declaration, "We can't fix injustice by looking away." Rachel stared at the words for a long moment. That sentence stayed with her for weeks, until one night she started sketching an idea on a notepad. The next morning, she launched a small campaign on social media called Number Be the Witness. It wasn't a protest, it was a promise, a call for ordinary citizens to calmly document acts of injustice, to stand as peaceful witnesses when silence might otherwise win. Within days, the movement exploded. People from across the country began sharing their own stories of stepping in to help, filming unlawful detentions, supporting victims of discrimination, or even intervening in small everyday injustices. It became a symbol of what Keanu's act had represented: courage with composure, justice through presence. Rachel appeared on morning talk shows, her voice calm but passionate. "We're not telling people to confront," she said. "We're asking them to stand by. To say, 'I'm here. I see you.' That's how change starts." Keanu watched one of her interviews one night from a hotel room in Arizona. He smiled faintly, proud but quiet. He never reached out, never claimed credit, but he didn't need to. The world had taken what it needed from that day and made it something bigger. Back in Texas, Officer Marisol Vega found herself in a new role too. Her calm handling of the incident had earned her respect from both civilians and fellow officers. She was invited to speak at a statewide conference on policing ethics, where she shared what she had learned that day. "De-escalation isn't weakness," she said to a room full of officers. "It's strength. It's the difference between control and compassion." That man's fear could have ended his life, if not for one person's decision to stay calm. Her words resonated deeply. Departments began requesting her for training sessions. She became a quiet but powerful advocate for reform, not as an outsider criticizing the system, but as someone inside it, determined to make it better. In the months that followed, Marisol helped implement new policies emphasizing empathy in law enforcement training. She met with community leaders, rebuilt trust in neighborhoods that had long felt abandoned, and even began a mentorship program for young recruits. Her colleagues respected her more than ever, not for being loud, but for being true. Every once in a while, she still thought about that day. The heat, the tension, the man trembling by his truck. She often wondered if she'd have found the same courage had Keanu not been there first. But she always came back to one truth. Sometimes, courage is contagious. The ripple kept spreading. A few towns over, high school students started a Number Be the Witness Club, meeting every Friday to discuss empathy, fairness, and how to de-escalate conflict. Their teacher printed out Keanu's quote, "It wasn't about fame, it was about decency," and taped it above the classroom door. Every student who walked in had to touch it, like a quiet pledge to carry that principle into the world. David Carter visited that same classroom one spring morning. He stood before the students in his work shirt, hands still stained faintly from engine grease. He wasn't polished or rehearsed, but he spoke from the heart. "That day, I was terrified," he told them. "But now, I live with something better than fear. I live with purpose. If someone ever makes you feel small, remember, you still have worth. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." The students applauded, and one girl raised her hand. "Did you ever see him again? The man who helped you?" David smiled. "Yes," he said, "and I learned something from him. Sometimes, the people who help us most don't fix our problems. They remind us we're worth fixing them ourselves." Across town, Officer Marisol Vega's reform initiative caught national attention. She appeared on public service announcements urging officers to listen before they lead. Her department saw a measurable drop in civilian complaints, and several precincts across Texas adopted her model. She never sought credit. She only wanted to prove that compassion could coexist with authority. And then, one quiet evening, something unexpected happened. After months of silence, Hank Dobson appeared on live television. He sat alone at a press conference table, no uniform, no badge, just a man facing the consequences of his own words. The reporters were skeptical, waiting for excuses. Instead, he looked into the camera and spoke plainly. "I was wrong," he said. "I forgot what the badge stood for. I let pride turn into anger, and I let anger blind me to another man's humanity. I don't ask for forgiveness. I just want people to know I see it now, and I'm trying to change." The clip went viral overnight. It wasn't dramatic or rehearsed. It was humble, the kind of honesty that can only come from regret. David watched the statement from his living room and nodded quietly. "Good," he whispered. "That's a start." Meanwhile, far from the noise of cities and cameras, Keanu Reeves was back on the road. He rode through long stretches of desert, the sky endless above him. No entourage, no interviews, no headlines, just the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the wind. He didn't think about the movement that had followed him or the praise that surrounded his name. He thought about David's family, Marisol's, courage, and even Hank's apology. He thought about how one act of decency had created waves that touched lives he would never meet. As the sun sank low behind the mountains, he looked out at the horizon and smiled softly. The world was far from perfect, but on days like this, it felt a little closer. A full year passed before Keanu Reeves returned to Texas again, this time not by chance, but by invitation. The city of Dallas was hosting a civil rights event dedicated to ordinary citizens whose small acts had created extraordinary change. The auditorium was filled with teachers, community leaders, veterans, and students, people from every walk of life who believed in decency over division. Keanu arrived quietly through the side entrance, wearing a simple dark suit, no press entourage, and no announcement. The crowd didn't notice him slip in, and that was how he preferred it. He took a seat in the back row, his hands folded loosely as the event began. The host, a respected local journalist, stepped up to the microphone. "A year ago," she began, A video from a small Texas gas station reminded the world that courage doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes, it looks like one person calmly stepping forward when everyone else stays silent. The lights dimmed, and on the screen behind her appeared a still image, the moment frozen in history. Keanu, standing beside David Carter, the officer's handcuffs glinting in the sunlight. The audience murmured softly, many recognizing the scene instantly. The host continued, "Tonight, we honor those who proved that one moment of moral clarity can ripple across the world." When she said David's name, the crowd erupted in applause. David Carter walked on stage in a neatly pressed gray suit, his shoulders straight, his eyes bright. He looked confident, far removed from the frightened man in the viral video. His wife, Sharon, and daughters sat in the front row, their smiles glowing with pride. David approached the podium, his hands trembling just slightly as he adjusted the microphone. "I'm not a public speaker," he said, his voice steady but humble. "I'm just a mechanic from Abilene who had a bad day that turned into something bigger than I could have imagined." The audience chuckled softly, easing the tension. David took a breath, scanning the faces in the crowd. "That day could have gone 100 different ways," he said. "But what changed it wasn't anger. It wasn't shouting. It was one man deciding that silence wasn't an option." The room fell silent. "Justice doesn't need anger. It needs courage," he continued. "It needs people who care enough to stand close, to bear witness, to remind others that doing right doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be human." The audience rose in applause, a wave of emotion filling the room. Keanu clapped along with everyone else, staying seated in the back, his expression soft and reflective. David smiled, a hint of gratitude in his eyes as he looked toward the crowd. "That man didn't just help me," he said. "He helped me believe that good still exists, and that maybe, if enough of us choose it, it can win." The audience rose again, louder this time. Cameras flashed, but Keanu remained in the shadows, quietly proud, content to watch. When the applause finally died down, the host returned to the stage. "Tonight," she said, "we present a special recognition, the Acts of Moral Courage Award, to two individuals whose integrity changed lives and inspired hope." The lights swept across the crowd and stopped on Keanu, still seated in the back. The audience gasped, then rose once more, cheering as he stood and walked down the aisle, humbled and quiet as ever. As Keanu made his way to the stage, the applause grew into a roar. People stood, clapping not just for the actor they admired, but for the man who had quietly done what others were too afraid to do. He smiled humbly, shaking his head slightly as if to say he didn't deserve it. When he reached David, the two men embraced a simple, human gesture that spoke louder than any speech. The host handed them both the award plaques, etched with the words, "For courage without anger." David turned his award in his hands, his eyes misty. Keanu glanced down at his, then at David, and smiled. "I think this one belongs to you," he whispered. David shook his head. "No, you started it." They both laughed quietly, the crowd watching with warmth that filled the entire room. When it was Keanu's turn to speak, he stepped up to the microphone and looked out over the audience. He didn't read from notes. His voice was calm, steady, and sincere. "I've played heroes on screen," he began. "But that day at the gas station reminded me that real heroes don't have scripts. They just make a choice, a small one, a necessary one. I don't think anyone wakes up planning to change the world, but maybe we can change one moment, one person's fear, one act of injustice, and that's enough to start something bigger." The audience listened in stillness. Every word carried the same quiet conviction that had defined him that day. Under the Texas Sunday, Keanu's gaze drifted toward David's family. "I didn't save anyone," he said softly. "I just stood where I was needed, and anyone can do that." When he stepped back, the crowd erupted again. It wasn't the kind of applause reserved for fame. It was gratitude, the sound of hundreds of people recognizing something rare, integrity that asked for nothing in return. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to thin, Keanu walked outside into the cool Texas night. The air smelled faintly of rain. He looked up at the stars, remembering that scorching day, the heat, the smell of fuel, the fear in David's voice. So much had changed since then. Lives had been altered, hearts opened, systems questioned. Yet, in his mind, it still came down to that single question he'd asked. Do you need a witness? He smiled to himself, thinking how simple it had been, how quiet, and yet, how deeply it had rippled. David joined him outside a few minutes later. Crazy how life works, huh? He said. Keanu nodded. Crazy and beautiful. They shook hands one last time under the streetlights. The crowd inside kept cheering for others, but out there, the world was still again. One man had spoken, another had stood, and together, they had reminded the world that decency could still change everything. The story closes not in noise, but in quiet. A year after the Texas incident, the world has changed in ways that can't be measured by headlines or numbers, only by the lives it touched. David Carter sits in his backyard on a warm evening, laughing with his wife and daughters. The same man who once trembled in fear now tells stories about hope. His daughters giggle as he flips burgers on the grill, teasing him about becoming famous. Sharon leans her head on his shoulder, smiling. You gave people something to believe in, she says. David shakes his head softly. No, he replies. Someone just reminded me I mattered. Across the state, Officer Marisol Vega stands in front of a group of new cadets. The training field hums with the sound of footsteps and shouted commands, but her voice cuts through calm and steady. Before you enforce the law, she tells them, remember the people. Every stop, every call, every moment you're dealing with someone's father, sister, or son, don't forget that. The recruits listen closely. Some take notes. Others simply watch the conviction in her eyes. Later that day, she helps a young officer struggling to manage a tense situation. Her tone is patient. Her instructions deliberate. When the officer thanks her afterward, she smiles. That's how we change things, she says. One shift at a time. And then, far from both of them, Hank Dobson walks through the doors of a community center in Lubbock. The walls are covered with murals painted by local kids, bright colors, hopeful faces. He's not in uniform anymore. He volunteers now, teaching self-defense to teenagers and talking about the importance of respect. The first time he walked into that center, most people looked away. Now, they greet him with cautious curiosity. Some, even with trust. One afternoon, a young boy asks him why he's there. Hank looks at him for a long moment and says, because once, I forgot who I was supposed to be, and I'm trying to earn back the right to wear my own name. He doesn't talk about the video or the hearing. He just shows up every week, doing the quiet work that matters most. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves continues his journey down quiet roads, visiting small towns, funding scholarships, and supporting shelters in secret. He avoids interviews about the incident, never turning it into a spotlight moment. Yet, his name still surfaces every few months, attached to stories of kindness of small checks, left at charities with no signature, of meals paid for anonymously at diners, of people saying he changed their view of what decency looks like. His reflection, carried through his words and choices, becomes a kind of invisible compass for others. It reminds the world that humility and courage can coexist and that justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands still. The screen fades from the bright lights of the Dallas event to the soft glow of dawn. A montage begins quiet, human, real. David Carter walks hand in hand with his daughters down a sunlit street. Their laughter fills the morning air. At his side, Sharon carries a small bag of groceries, smiling as she listens to her husband tell a joke only he finds funny. The man who once trembled in fear now moves with quiet confidence, his heart lighter, his spirit unbroken. Cut 2. Officer Marisol Vega on the training field, walking among young cadets. Her voice is calm and firm as she says, every uniform you wear is a promise. not a weapon. The recruits nod, eyes bright with respect. Behind her, a mural of the words integrity, compassion, justice glimmers in the sunlight. Then, the image shifts to Hank Dobson at the community center. He kneels beside a group of teenagers, helping them paint a new mural on the wall, hands of different colors reaching toward each other. He laughs as a boy accidentally splashes paint on his shirt. For the first time in years, he looks at peace. And finally, we see Keanu Reeves, alone on a quiet road, the sunset spilling gold across the asphalt. His motorcycle hums softly beneath him as he rides through the desert, wind sweeping through his hair, eyes focused on the horizon. His voice fades in over the images, gentle but full of conviction. Justice isn't loud, he says. It doesn't always stand behind a podium or march in the streets. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's the courage to stand still when the world looks away. The scene cuts to black and white clips of everyday people, students stopping bullies, neighbors helping strangers, bystanders filming when no one else dares. Keanu's voice continues. You don't need fame or power or permission to do what's right. All it takes is one decision to see someone, to care, and to act with compassion. Images appear of real people holding signs with number "Be the Witness" written across them. A police officer hugs a civilian. A teacher comforts a crying student. A teenager records a moment of kindness instead of cruelty. Keanu's words slow, his tone softening. That's what it means to be human. Not perfect, not fearless, just willing to stand for something good. The screen fades to David's home again. His daughters play in the yard while he sits on the porch, his arm around Sharon. The world has not become perfect, but it has become kinder, one choice at a time. Keanu's voice grows quiet, almost reflective. We all have power, he says. Power to film, power to speak, power to protect someone who can't protect themselves, power to do what's right, even when it's hard. A final image fills the screen. Keanu standing at the edge of a Texas highway, the same stretch of road where it all began. The wind tugs at his jacket, the sun dipping low behind him. He turns slightly toward the camera and speaks his final words. Would you have stepped forward that day? He asks softly. Have you ever seen someone mistreated and wanted to help but hesitated? A brief pause lingers, the sound of wind and distant traffic, the only answer. Then, with warmth in his tone, he continues. Tell me your story in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation alive. Because maybe the next time you see something wrong, you'll remember you have the power to be the witness. The music swells gently. The final frame reads, "One moment of courage can change the world." Then, the screen fades to black.